No one's ever said to me, it was a great speech, Leigh, but I wish you'd spoken a bit longer, so I won't delay you. But I would like to welcome you all, and welcome especially Sir Niall Ferguson. But I don't want to repeat all of what Georgina said, but I particularly want to thank the members of the board of the Robert Menzies Institute, our principal backers, the Cormac Foundation of the Menzies Research Centre and the University of Melbourne, and our supporters. And many of you here are our supporters, and those who aren't, I hope you'll be encouraged by the end of the evening. And I thought I'd just talk a little bit about the legacy of one of Australia's great influential leaders, but also reflect on the enduring values he championed: freedom, opportunity, and enterprise. And under the leadership of Georgina, and she's done a fantastic job over the last 3 years, the Robert Menzies Institute has become an important centre for historical research, education and outreach. She and her team have worked hard to ensure that the legacy that he left is better known to all Victorians. So thank you very much for coming tonight. And as I was talking to Sir Niall beforehand, there's not much to talk about what's going on in the world. There's hardly any conflict. But I think there's plenty we can talk about globally. And in Australia, not much. I mean, there's a fair bit of debate about what the Sydney Turf Club and others are doing to the VRC and the horse racing events and try to ruin our spring carnival, but he probably won't delve into the details of that. So let me say thank you very much for coming. We appreciate your support, and if you're enthused after this evening, I'm sure Gina and her team will be glad to accommodate you if you wish to support us. So thank you very much.
As Leigh said, this is a fantastic evening and our biggest ever yet. Those of you who were here last year, or at least at the Windsor Hotel last year, where we welcomed our third Robert Menzies orator, a fellow Scot actually, in Fraser Nelson. And the year before we were here with Jonathan Sumption, a Brit, but not a Scot. And of course the first year with our own Australian and then Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg. But this is the biggest yet, and I am hopeful for the future that we keep getting bigger and bigger. I have led the Robert Menzies Institute since its inception, since its birth in April 2021. And I really think we have gone from strength to strength since those heady days in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, when I literally was sitting in my kids' playroom trying to work out what to do with this fantastically exciting mandate of the Robert Menzies Institute. We now are based in the beautiful and historic old quadrangle at the University of Melbourne, the heart of the university, and in a university that was so connected with Robert Menzies, his alma mater, and also where he was Chancellor, and the university he gave his entire library to. It is a true honour to do this job, working every day to inspire Australians with the story of their nation, that 20th century history of a nation that is one of the world's most successful liberal democracies, a nation that's grounded in Menzies' values, as Leigh was saying, of freedom, of enterprise and opportunity. But the longer I work at a university, and I'm a mother of two school-age kids, and I observe their education, the more urgently I feel there is a crisis with the study and learning and scholarship in Australian history. Now, there are a wonderful history podcast. I know Niall has had some words to say about the problems with history podcasts, or so-called historians on podcasts recently. But look, there are wonderful podcasts bringing history into the mainstream. Niall's podcast with his fellow Hoover Institution fellows, Good Fellows, is wonderful. There's The Rest is History, if there are followers of that in the room. And there are musicals like Hamilton and Six, which bring history, as I said, into the mainstream and pop culture. These are bright sparks, but they're pretty rare, little bright sparks. The truth is that when you look at the trends in our schools and universities when it comes to history education and learning and scholarship, they are dismal. Now, I know for those of you in the room, for our annual dinner last year, you would have heard me talk about the problem with the study of Australian history in Victoria. But for those of you who weren't here last year, I'll reiterate it. Victoria, and actually this will come as a surprise to you, Victoria is actually the only state in Australia where the subject in Year 12 Australian history exists. Now, it's not a popular subject. There are over 50,000 Year 12 students in Victoria, and this year less than 500 students take this subject. Only 50 schools teach it. And that's less than 1% if you've done the maths. But in any other state, and I know there are lots of you in the room tonight who come from Queensland or New South Wales, even South Australia, you don't have an option in the final years of school to study Australian history. No option. And in the years leading up to that, for kids in years 7 to 10, they only get 60 hours a year of history education. And that's just history, not Australian history. That's just history more broadly. So you can imagine there's only a tiny proportion of that 60 hours that is actually devoted to the 20th century Australian story. This is the story of our development, our federation, our development as a liberal democracy, our modernisation, our post-war construction, post-war modernisation and reconstruction, led by figures like Robert Menzies. By the time a student gets to university, with their very sparse knowledge that they will have accumulated at school of Australian history, it can come as no surprise that very, very few pursue a history degree. And in fact, the figures are bad. Since 2016, the number of students studying history at university has fallen by 23%. Now, if by some miracle a student at university enrolls in a history degree, and I think that really is a miracle, they'll find that the number of history lecturers, people like Niall, are thin on the ground. In the last 25 years, the number of academics working in history in Australian universities has fallen by 31%. And you may ask, what do they study, these history students, these miraculous diamonds in the rough who've chosen a history degree at university? What's available for them to study? And I know Niall has talked a lot about this through his time as a history academic at universities in the UK and the US. Well, my friend Dr. Bella Debrera at the Institute of Public Affairs has done quite a lot of research into this, and I'll acknowledge her good work. The history subjects at university are not talking about the history of Australian liberal democratic development. No, a third of them focus on issues of identity, of race, of gender and class, which is fine, but that's a third of their subject offering. That's a fairly large proportion of subjects that don't necessarily deal with the sort of fundamental building blocks, the core subjects that you would expect of history. Only 17% of history subjects at university deal with just some aspect of the Australian story. And at school, you find, when it comes to the study of Australian liberalism, which is the dominant and most important political philosophy that defines Australian middle-class values and our development, no subject teaches that. And Bella's research has shown that there is almost no treatment of the role of the individual, people like Robert Menzies, in Australian history subjects at both schools and university. In fact, one of our early pieces of advocacy work at the Robert Menzies Institute was convincing the Education Minister at the time, who's in the room tonight, Alan Tudge, to put just one reference to Robert Menzies in the Australian national curriculum. Just one. But for university history subjects, no Australian Prime Minister is mentioned in the subject descriptions of these subjects. So you can imagine what comes out of university at the other end. Now you may ask, does this matter? Do we care? Well, you're here in the room tonight to hear one of the world's leading historian, so I think the answer is you do know it matters and you do care. But if it needs a little bit of reinforcing, yes, it matters. It matters a lot. A knowledge of history is fundamental to our understanding of the present. It informs all the decisions that contribute to our democracy, our civic life, our foreign policy, our housing, our defence, our infrastructure, taxation, the economy. You need that context. You need to understand how people thought and came to the decisions they did in the past to inform how we make the decisions for today and the future. Today we see social cohesion in Australia at an extremely low ebb. I work at a university campus, and you can imagine what we witness day in, day out with the anti-Semitism and the encampments and the protests against key people in our academic community, in our Australian community, just because of the basis of their religion. There's a fracturing of national unity and I think a lack of understanding of the hard-fought freedoms we have here in Australia and how we developed into a democratic and prosperous nation. So a knowledge of history at this moment is absolutely critical. It's historians who help us shape and create the narrative of Australia, of our nation state. They help us understand how we came to be the democracy we are, how our institutions were built, how we got universal suffrage, the secret ballot, the preferential and compulsory voting. I know that not everyone loves them, but, that's a story. It's all this knowledge of history that gives us a sense of pride in our nation, a sense of belonging, and our shared identity and values. But we here at the Robert Menzies Institute are not just here to complain, although we do a bit of that. We're doing something to solve this problem. We were established to address this critical shortage of history education and scholarship in Australia. And it's our mission to promote the legacy and vision of Robert Menzies for Australia as a country of freedom, opportunity and enterprise. It's through our schools programs, our policy dialogues and academic conferences, our early careers network for university students, our exhibitions and events such as tonight, that we are building that contemporary understanding of Menzies' legacy and our Australian legacy, so future generations can be inspired by the extraordinary story of Australia's success, its freedom and prosperity. We can only do this with your support, and it's nights like tonight that I really feel we're on the right track, so thank you. We're building this community of people who are passionate about our history and passionate about future generations embracing it too. Please dig deep tonight if you can. Raffle tickets, donations. I know there are lots of QR codes on the table with donation forms available, and we all know how to use QR codes these days. Thank you for coming along tonight, and I'll leave you with this short, and I promise it's short, not like videos at other dinners, a short video about the Robert Menzies Institute. Thank you.
Understanding our nation's history frames who we are today and shapes the future we aspire to create. The Robert Menzies Institute is dedicated to bridging the gaps in our understanding of Australian history.
I think that Menzies' ideas of individual freedom, private enterprise and democracy are incredibly relevant today.
The Robert Menzies Institute is important because we want to promote active students who can actually think for themselves. So critical thinking is a key component of teaching in the 21st century.
And we can all lament the fact that our education system is failing to deliver a well-rounded education for young people. But how many of us can say we're doing something to change that? This is why your support of the Robert Menzies Institute matters.
There are knowledge gaps in my education, and an institution like the Robert Menzies Institute has filled those gaps.
ad in Nevada features two of Trump's former advisors describing him as unstable. Last week, Harris accused Trump of being exhausted. Donald Trump is not cognitively fit to be president, was the way Ezra Klein summed it up in the New York Times today. Trump's derangement was the headline of Joan Walsh's recent column in The Nation. Yet this line of attack, ladies and gentlemen, has a rather obvious weakness. Until July the 21st, the man who is currently President of the United States was repeatedly described by Democratic cheerleaders as being as sharp as a tack. It was only on that day that former President Barack Obama called Joe Biden at his home in Delaware and told him, and I quote, "Here's the deal. We have Kamala's approval to invoke the 25th Amendment," which would have meant declaring Biden unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. From that moment onwards, Biden went from being as sharp as a tack to being as politically dead as a doornail. The awkward thing is that while he was defenestrated as the Democratic nominee, he is still president. You might have forgotten that. And it's rather hard to persuade undecided voters that Donald Trump is cognitively less fit to be president than the current occupant of the White House. Now, pro-Harris journalists know this, which is why they keep falling back on the old Trump is Hitler line. The latest example is a piece just published by Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic under the headline, "Trump, I need the kind of generals that Hitler had." It's unfortunate that the anecdote with which Goldberg opens his essay, depicting Trump as indifferent to the feelings of relatives of the murdered Army Private Vanessa Guillen, was almost immediately repudiated by three people who were present, including her sister. It's even more unfortunate for the Democrats that research by the Center for Working Class Politics, which, as you can tell from its name, is not a conservative institution, shows that this whole line of argument is almost entirely ineffective in changing the minds of registered voters. I was wrong. I thought on January the 6th, 2021, that Donald Trump's political career was at an end. The reality is that regardless of how nefariously he behaved on that day, the Democrats have failed to persuade around half of likely voters that his conduct revealed him to be a Hitler-like threat to democracy. Indeed, January the 6th may well have failed to discredit Trump precisely because the first attempt to do so over his alleged collusion with the Russian government in 2016 turned out to be, as Trump would say, fake news. You see, crying wolf has these well-known disadvantages. The context of our current debate, of course, is very different from the one in which Robert Menzies spoke. Australia in 1934 was still in the grip of the Great Depression, the single biggest economic crisis of the industrial era. It was the severity of the Depression that made democracy seem so vulnerable in the 30s. But Menzies argued against that view. His message was that democracy depended not on a sense of entitlement to prosperity, but rather on a sense of obligation. And I'm going to quote Menzies here. "The greatest danger to democracy," he said, "lies in the readiness of the popular elector to be satisfied with low standards of government, to be bribed by promises of political and pecuniary advantages. Indeed, nothing is more disappointing to the political idealist than to see how frequently the only standard of judgment applied by the voter is, what is there in this for me?" By contrast, Menzies said, democracy's ultimate effective exercise calls for a motive force which can be supplied only by widespread interest in the problems of government. The good democrat is not the man who prates loudly of his rights, but the man who realizes that the social contract which binds any society together is one expressed primarily in terms of duties and obligations. The majority would not always be right, Menzies acknowledged. Here he is again. Indeed, since ignorance is more prevalent and frequently more vocal than knowledge, and since misrepresentation is all too commonly the chief weapon of the controversialist, all the chances are that at the first time of asking, the majority will be wrong. But the great quality of democracy is that it is flexible and responsive to changed opinion, and lends itself really to that process of trial and error by which progress comes and truth prevails. Now, as a Scotsman, I feel a strong sense of kinship with the man who wrote these words. Menzies' grandfather was born in Greenock in Renfrewshire, and married the daughter of a cobbler from Daresey in Fife, which is where my grandfather, John Ferguson, hailed from. Menzies, in fact, preferred his surname to be pronounced in the traditional Scottish manner, Mingus, which was the original of the nickname Ming the Merciless. Like my grandfather, like all my grandparents, Menzies, I'll stick with Menzies because that's what you're used to. Menzies was a passionate believer in social mobility through education. Unlike my paternal grandfather, Menzies didn't fight in the First World War, something his enemies never tired of pointing out, but that was the result of a family decision to keep one of the three Menzies brothers out of the trenches. Menzies' appeals during his lifetime, during his time in the political wilderness, to the forgotten people still resonates today. As Prime Minister after the war, he presided over important steps to liberalise Australian political life, as Troy Bramston shows in his recent and excellent biography. True, Menzies' views on racial matters don't read very well today. Nevertheless, the Australia we see around us today still bears his imprint. And the voices raised in hostility to King Charles's visit this week have been notable as much for their irrelevance as for their shrillness. Democracy turned out not to be doomed in the 1930s then. Thanks to Robert Menzies' generation, it survived the Great Depression. But it wasn't a sure thing. In 1934. Just a year later, the American author Sinclair Lewis published It Can't Happen Here. Anybody read it? A prize to that lady. Everyone should read this book, because in it, Lewis imagined an unscrupulous demagogue, actually a Democratic senator named Buzz Windrip, which is a good name, being elected president and swiftly turning the United States into a fascist regime, complete with paramilitary thugs called Minutemen and a Goebbels-like sidekick. This is a book I recommend to anyone who believes that Trump is the fulfillment of Sinclair's dystopian premonition. Moreover, democracy in the 30s also had to fight for its survival in the most destructive war in history, and it was very far from guaranteed when that war began in 1939 that the democracies would prevail. Indeed, victory over the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, came only after Hitler made the fatal mistake of attacking not only the Soviet Union, but also the United States. Remember, the Allied side that won the Second World War was not a pure coalition of democracies. For Stalin was one of the big three, and the price he demanded for the Red Army's role in Hitler's defeat was paid at Yalta and thereafter by the peoples in Eastern Europe and elsewhere who were condemned to live under communist dictatorship. Well, by comparison, our generation has been fortunate to have been spared a Great Depression. Indeed, so creative have our central bankers and finance ministers become in the past 2 decades that we're beginning to forget what a recession is like. And yet, despite the sustained economic growth we've enjoyed, there still seem reasons to fear for the health of democracy around the world. For the past few years, my Hoover Institution colleague Larry Diamond has been warning of a democratic recession. Each year, the non-profit Freedom House publishes its Freedom in the World report. The latest edition states, and I quote, that global freedom declined for the 18th consecutive year in 2023. These and similar assessments remind me of Fareed Zakaria's warning way back in 1997 that the future would belong to illiberal democracy. Well, as everybody knows, democracy was invented in ancient Athens in the 5th century BC. But only in the past century has it been widely and durably adopted as a form of government. Why, you ask yourselves, was democracy previously so short-lived? Why were the democracies prior to the modern era ephemeral? The answer is because classical and Renaissance political philosophy taught that democracy was inherently unstable. The rule of the people was an ephemeral staging post between aristocracy and monarchy or tyranny. Now, this was a great concern of America's founding fathers, which was why they were so careful to separate and limit the powers of the branches of government in their constitution. Even in the 19th century, the great French political theorist Alexis de Tocqueville regarded the United States as exceptional, not just because of the Constitution, but also because of the vigor of American religious and associational life. Tocqueville's conclusion was that democracy could never work in France because too many of his compatriots preferred equality to liberty. And that was why they ended up with a Napoleon twice. Let's look at the world today. About half of all countries are democracies. According to the Varieties of Democracy project at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, 90 of the 178 countries for which data were available in 2022 recently held truly free and fair multi-party elections. The oldest democracies in the world, all over a century old, are Switzerland, followed by Australia, New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, the UK, the US, Canada, and Sweden. In other words, long-lived democracy is an Anglophone and Nordic phenomenon. In my view, Switzerland should be disqualified, by the way, for not allowing women to vote until 1971. So, in fact, this country is the oldest true democracy. You should be proud of that. Here's an amazing thing. Only 24 democracies are more than 60 years old. 20 are less than 19 years old. What's more, of those 90 or so democracies, only 32, a third, qualify as liberal democracies. That is to say, they not only allow all adults to vote, but they also protect civil and political liberties through such vitally important institutions as independent courts and a free press, and I might add, think tanks like the Robert Menzies Institute. That's liberal democracy. It's not just about voting. Now, from a high of 44 back in 2007 or thereabouts, the number of liberal democracies has actually fallen. It's down to 32, as I said. Illiberal democracies, they have elections but not much else, are up from 46 in 2007 to 59 today. But electoral autocracies like Vladimir Putin's Russia, which have elections but those are a sham, those have actually declined in number from 63 in 2013 to 54, while the pure autocracies, think Saudi Arabia, are actually up from 23 in 2018 to 34 now. Now, of course, some countries, as you are well aware, are very large and some are very small. So it's really more meaningful, isn't it, to look at shares of the world's population living under these different regimes. As predicted by Fareed Zakaria, the proportion of people in liberal democracies has indeed fallen from a secular high of 17% back in the period 1993 to 2011 to just 13% last year. However, as not predicted by Fareed, the share in the illiberal democracies is down even further from 37% to 16%. The share in electoral autocracies, meanwhile, is up hugely from 17% in 2001 to 44%, while the share in the outright autocracies is also up from 23% to 27%. So these data would seem to confirm the Larry Diamond thesis of a democratic recession, if not actually a democratic depression. But are they to be trusted? Remember, this is political science, and that's an oxymoron. As India is now certainly the world's most populous country and certainly its most populous democracy, it kind of matters how India is classified. And this is where it gets quite interesting. Any Indians here? All right. Well, this is the key to understanding if democracy is winning, losing, in recession, doomed. So one set of political scientists say that India has been an electoral autocracy since 2017, with civil and political rights as limited as they were during Indira Gandhi's state of emergency back in the mid-1970s. But other political scientists disagree. There's one data set that classifies India as a straight-up democracy. Freedom House downgraded India to partly free 2 years ago, but actually 66 out of 100 is not a terrible score when neighbouring Pakistan is on 35. And the Economist Intelligence Unit, I checked today, has this modest decline in India's democratic score from 7.9 out of a possible 10 in 2014 to 7.2 in 2023. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, all these indices of democracy that you read about should be taken not just with a pinch of salt, but with all the salt you have in this room. Just don't buy this stuff. It is, I think, pseudoscience. It boils down to this. Whether you think liberal democracy is in some kind of global crisis depends entirely on your opinion of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. That's it. There's another quirk of democracy which I think Robert Menzies would have appreciated. One of the more remarkable features of the modern world, which I don't think any of the great thinkers of the 18th and 19th century would have expected, is the persistence of monarchy. Now, the US media love portraying the UK as quaintly eccentric for still having a hereditary king. It's always worth a few cheap laughs in the New York Times. But the reality is that constitutional and, it must be said, non-constitutional monarchies can be found all over the world. Today, 43 sovereign nation-states have a monarch, of which the majority are democracies, including 15 members of the Commonwealth that, like Australia, have Charles III as their head of state. In Europe, Belgium, Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain and Sweden, all are monarchies. In short, there are plenty of liberal democracies, more than 30, even if a surprising number of them turn out to be monarchies rather than republics. And while they're not all that populous, they are rich. If you add up the gross domestic products of all the countries that have provided aid to Ukraine in the past 2.5 years, it's roughly half of global GDP. And that ought to suffice, you might think, to keep the doom of democracy at bay. The problem is that, as was true in the 1930s, it may not suffice. In an essay last year, the New York Times' David Leonhardt argued, and I quote, "If the US embraced only those countries with purer democratic records than India, it would not be able to create a very powerful global alliance. The US, Canada, Western Europe, Japan and South Korea are not strong enough to dominate the world as they once could." Did you notice? He forgot Australia. On the other side, ladies and gentlemen, as has become increasingly clear over the past 2 years, is a new axis that is in many ways more formidable than the one that emerged before and during the Second World War. Russia is waging its war on Ukraine with growing material assistance not only from China, but also from Iran and North Korea. I've called it the axis of ill will to distinguish it from the fictitious axis of evil dreamt up by David Frum for George W. Bush way back in 2002. It's well known that Chinese exports to Russia, predominantly but not only dual-use hardware that can be used for military production, have roughly doubled since the war in Ukraine began, and that Iran has been supplying Moscow with both drones and missiles. Less noticed is the amount of material coming to Russia from North Korea. By mid-2024, Pyongyang had supplied Russia with up to 4.8 million shells and rockets from its stockpiles, as well as ballistic missiles. And now we learn that North Korean troops are on their way to the battlefields of Ukraine. Yes, on paper, Allied support for Ukraine has been generous. If you look at the latest Ukraine support tracker from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, between January 2022 and June 2024, around 40 countries together made bilateral commitments to Ukraine totaling $334 billion. But only $218 billion of that sum has actually been allocated, and military allocations of hardware have fallen by more than a third in the past 12 months. I was in Kyiv 6 weeks ago. The mood of bitterness is growing in that country. If you compare the effort made when Saddam Hussein sought to annex Kuwait in 1990, it's quite striking. Relative to gross domestic product, Germany spent more than 3 times more on the liberation of Kuwait than it is spending on liberating Ukraine. And Kuwait was anything but a democracy. Total allocated aid from Germany to Ukraine amounts to just 0.37% of GDP. For the US, the figure's 0.35%. For France, it's 0.16%. For Italy, it is 0.11%. There's no excuse for this when the Baltic states and Denmark have all allocated more than 1% of GDP. were Donald Trump to be re-elected, as I've already shown, his critics foresee a threat to the constitutional order, but they also foresee a threat to the liberal international order. In a second Trump term, it's often argued, I hear it every day, Trump would pull the plug on support for Ukraine. So the crux of the question before us is democracy doomed? Is the American election? If Trump's critics are right, and he is Buzz Windrip, then democracy may well be doomed. Not only in the United States, but also in the wider world, beginning in Eastern Europe. I said at the beginning of this year that the US election was like a choice between republic and empire. By that I meant that if you believe Trump poses a threat to the republic, you must vote for the Democratic candidate. But if you believe that the Democratic candidate poses a threat to American primacy in the world, then you must vote for Trump. It's a very Roman dilemma. Republic or empire. Now, I accept that, as Trump's former Chief of Staff General John Kelly said this week, President Trump has no great respect for the Constitution or the law, though I think to say that he falls into the general definition of fascist, which is what General Kelly said, goes too far. But, ladies and gentlemen, the question is not how far Trump has authoritarian proclivities. The question is how far he would be able to indulge them if re-elected to a second term. That's the question. So the question I keep asking, to which I have yet to receive a good answer, is how exactly would Trump change the Constitution to give himself a third term, something unambiguously ruled out by the 22nd Amendment? Tell me how. Here's another one. Suppose, as in his first term, Trump sought to change US immigration policy by executive order, but the court struck down his order. What would he do, what could he do, if the Supreme Court upheld the initial court ruling against him? And finally, what if Trump did order the US military to take action against domestic political opponents? Where is the evidence anywhere that senior echelons of the US Army would be willing to carry out such an order? Let me put it another way. There is no aspect of the Republican platform that envisions any change to the Constitution. If elected, Trump would seek to extend the soon-to-expire tax cuts of his first term, and he might seek to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, though these have been so beneficial to red states that it's hard to see any good political reasons for doing that. He would use executive authority to enact new tariffs, strengthen border security, and exert greater control over executive agencies. The Schedule F executive order, which was originally issued in late 2020, then reversed by the Biden administration, would allow him to fire at will roughly 50,000 civil service positions. But none of this is remotely unconstitutional. The irony is that it's not Trump, but the more radical Democrats who openly discuss constitutional changes that would fundamentally alter the US political system to their own advantage. I'll give you just one example of many. In an article published a couple of years ago in the New York Times, two liberal professors at respectively Harvard and Yale, Ryan Doerfler and Samuel Moyn, urged Democrats not to try to reclaim the, quote, broken Constitution, but to, quote, radically alter the basic rules of the game. It's difficult, they wrote, to find a constitutional basis for abortion or labour unions in a document written by largely affluent men more than 2 centuries ago. It would be far better if liberal legislators could simply make a case for abortion and labour rights on their own merits without having to bother with the Constitution. Oh, it gets better. Quote, "In democracy, majority rule always must matter most," they declared. "It should not have to, quote, survive vetoes from powerful minorities that invoke the constitutional past to obstruct a new future. A new way of fighting within American democracy must start with a more open politics of altering our fundamental law, perhaps in the first place by making the Constitution more amendable than it is now." So what did Dörfler and Moyne have in mind precisely, you may ask yourselves? Quote, "One way to get to this more democratic world," they wrote, "is to pack the Union with new states. In order to break the false deadlock that the Constitution imposes through the Electoral College and Senate on the country, in which substantial majorities are foiled on issue after issue. Alternatively," and I quote, "Congress could simply pass a Congress Act, reorganizing our legislature in ways that are more fairly representative of where people actually live and vote, and perhaps even reducing the Senate to a mere council of revision without the power to obstruct laws." In this way, our professors concluded, quote, "The basic structure of government, like whether to elect the president by majority vote or to limit judges to fixed terms, would be decided by the present electorate as opposed to one from some foggy past." End quote. To anyone who reveres the US Constitution, as I do as an American citizen, the most successful political document in the history of mankind, all of this is blood-curdling. It is nothing less than a call for revolution, for replacement of the American Republic with a unicameral tyranny of the majority. Here, it seems to me, is a much more explicit threat to the Constitution than Donald Trump's erratic personality, as interpreted by Democratic journalists and former officials Trump once fired. And who is to say that if elected with majorities in the Senate and the House, Vice President Harris would not be open to such revolutionary schemes? Do away with the Senate filibuster, which Harris has said she would do, to enact a federal right to abortion, and the opportunities also to pack the Supreme Court and add Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia as new and reliably blue states, each with 2 senators, would be kinda tempting, wouldn't it? The real threats to democracy, take other forms too. Let me revive an old question that political scientists used to ask back in the 1970s. Is there a political economy of democratic self-destruction via excessive debt and inflation? With deficits in excess of 5% of GDP as far as the eye can see, it's worth recalling that history has very few examples of great powers that stayed great for long after the costs of debt service exceeded the costs of defense, as they have in the United States this year for the first time. That, more than Trump's alleged Russophilia, is the real problem for America's allies, including, by the way, Australia. On its current trajectory, which I assume would continue under a Harris presidency, US defense spending simply does not suffice simultaneously to defend Ukraine, Israel, and also Taiwan if all 3 are under attack from the axis of ill will. I'll go further. On its current trajectory, the foreign policy of the Biden-Harris administration, which is what they called it from the outset, remember, likely condemns Ukraine to be defeated, Israel to risk a war against Iran with only limited US support, and Taiwan to fear a blockade by China at some point in the next 4 years. The signature term of this administration's foreign policy has been de-escalation. It's only recently that I have figured out that this term is the functional opposite of deterrence. Now, we don't know, and we can't know, if Trump is right when he says that the attacks on Ukraine and Israel would not have occurred if he had been re-elected in 2020. All we do know is that no such acts of aggression by authoritarian powers occurred during his first term. As between the Constitution and American primacy in the world, I would say that the latter looks more vulnerable to 4 more years of democratic government than the former does to 4 more years of Trump. Robert Menzies believed in a democracy that was firmly rooted in an educated citizenry, a vibrant civil society, the rule of law based on private property rights, and a culture of humility. Though the majority may be wrong today, he wrote, courage and patience on the part of those actively engaged in affairs with wisdom which is born of bitter experience will make the majority right tomorrow. There are many reasons to view the state of democracy in the world today with disquiet, but to say that it is doomed is surely absurd. There was far more to fear in 1934 than there is in 2024. And even if mistakes are made in our time, as Menzies said, they can be corrected. There's always 2028, when I am confident another American general election will be held without Donald Trump's name on the ballot. In my most recent book, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, I tried to point out that we human beings are rather too inclined to prophesy doom, the end of the world as we know it, when what we really need to do is to improve the way we handle the medium-sized disasters we are much more likely to encounter in our lives. Perhaps it will turn out on November 5th that I'm wrong, and that I should have given my book a different subtitle, The Catastrophe of Politics. Perhaps it's not Robert Menzies who'll be vindicated, but Sinclair Lewis. But ladies and gentlemen, at the risk of tempting fate, I am going to side with Menzies and against the prophets of democratic doom. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Timothy Lynch, and I'm a political scientist. I'm a professor of American politics at the University of Melbourne. What do the Pet Shop Boys, George Orwell, Simon and Garfunkel, and Neil Ferguson have in common? They are the only men whose work I own in their entirety. Professor Ferguson's sales approach the former. I have helped him in this regard, though in truth he has not needed it. I, on the other hand, have imbibed his understanding of US power and its prospects so completely, I often forget where he ends and I start. This might count as plagiarism, but since my chances of being president of Harvard are slim, though somewhat better than his, even though he actually works there, I don't care. A career in academia has taught me that there are three types of books and the authors that write them. First, those I will not buy, like Noam Chomsky. Second, those I buy but do not read, like Bob Woodward. And those I buy and read cover to cover, like Niall Ferguson. So as a new member, very proud new member, until my employer finds out, of the Robert Menzies Institute Board, on behalf of the Institute and all present here, can I propose a vote of thanks for Professor Ferguson's brilliant Menzies oration?
A wonderful oration. I'm sure Fraser and Jonathan and Josh won't mind me saying, but our best yet.
I'll take the compliment. Thank you.
I do want to talk about your thesis a bit more and test it. But given I'm based at a university, you're based at a university, and I know you've spoken a lot about your diagnosis of the problems with universities at the moment. I wonder if you can explain your view of how universities have got to the point they have, where they have become places of homogenous thought, intolerant of diversity of opinion, actually not supporting academic freedom despite professing often to do so. And of course, our most recent manifestation of this trend has been the absolutely appalling levels of anti-Semitism that have been playing out on our campuses. How did we get here? How did universities that people like Robert Menzies thought were so critical to the health of our democracy, how did they become almost the sort of exemplar of the problems with our democracy?
Well, it's a question I've thought a lot about. I spent my adult life in universities. My uncle Ian would keep asking when I was going to get a real job. and sometimes I know what he meant. I think the United States is the key here because it has set the fashions that the rest of the English-speaking world has tended to follow. And to understand why American universities went woke, to use a very crude shorthand, you have to understand the peculiar dynamics of universities as institutions in the United States. Because it's not enough to say suddenly there were smartphones and social media and the undergraduates all went a little crazy, which, to caricature it, is something of Jonathan Haidt's argument. I don't think that gets to the heart of this, because I don't think the undergraduates are the key. There are really three constituencies that propel universities to the left. But first, you have to understand that they weren't always left-wing institutions. They've become decidedly more left-wing in my lifetime. And that's measurable. The proportions of registered Democrats relative to registered Republicans in US universities can be tracked. And the swing has been a remarkable one, so that you have ratios of 14 to 1, 15 to 1, 17 to 1, I think, in history of Democrats to Republicans. You can't calculate the ratio in anthropology because there are 0 Republicans. So there's been a swing to the left amongst the faculty. Liberals hired progressives, and progressives hired cultural Marxists. And the level of intellectual tolerance went down with each step. Many of the liberals now regret this. They're coming to the end of their careers and they look at the departments that they destroyed by hiring ideologues who believed that their mission was not to educate, but to agitate. People who thought that being an activist was the career of a professor. So that's part of it. But the second part of it, which is really crucial in the US, is the bureaucracy. Because American universities, especially the elite universities, the Harvards, the Yales, the Princetons, the Stanfords, have been drowning in money, swimming in money. And that money has been channeled into building an enormous bureaucracy. There are now more administrators at Yale than undergraduates. I kid you not. I kid you not. And these people have jobs such as diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. What do you do? What do you do all day? I'm the DEI officer. And there's 99 others in the corridor. What do we do? And the answer is, you persecute anybody who steps out of ideological line. You've all read George Orwell, clearly. And you know that in Orwell's 1984, words mean the opposite of that which they appear to mean. So diversity, in fact, means uniformity. And equity means zero due process if you fall foul of the thought police. And inclusion means we have to kick the conservatives off this campus and never let them back. That's DEI. And so this bureaucracy set about policing thought on university campuses with increasing aggressiveness over the past 10 years. And it happened so fast, Georgina, that anybody who graduated prior to 2014 was not really aware of what was going on. The craziness is of roughly 10 years date. And that meant that until October the 7th last year, there were all kinds of very wealthy alumni of Harvard sitting in Wall Street, of Stanford sitting in Silicon Valley, who had no idea and thought I had lost my mind when I would tell them the university has become like a totalitarian regime to the extent that people are informing on their colleagues. October the 7th had this one great benefit, that it caused the scales to fall from many people's eyes. But it's very, very hard to undo what's been done in the last 10 years because the woke professors have been tenured and the bureaucracy is very hard to get rid of. You can change the president of the university, you can get rid of Claudine Gay, but all that she did in her time is very hard to undo. So I have come to the conclusion that these great American universities, which were certainly the great universities in the world 20 years ago, are going to take a generation to fix. I don't have that time, which is why we set up a new university in Austin that is designed to model academic freedom and meritocracy. I do not believe you can wrest control back from these people once they've taken control of an institution. And the last thing I'll say is, I cannot speak for Melbourne. I do not know what has gone on here. But I can speak for Oxford and Cambridge. It is not too late to stop these universities becoming like Harvard and Yale. It's not too late because they haven't had the resources to hire 100 DEI officers. They just don't have the funds. The DEI office in Oxford is like 11 people. And so things are moving more slowly there than they did in the US, and I suspect it's true here. I don't think it doesn't seem as crazy here as it has been at Stanford or Columbia, for example. So please, I appeal to you, whatever you can do to stop this mind virus spreading through your institutions, do it now. And if anybody argues with you, show them scenes from the Columbia campus, scenes from the Harvard campus, and say, is this really how you wanted to end here? Is this where you want us to end up? That's my simple message, is it's not too late in the rest of the Anglosphere to stop this insanity.
Well, I hope you're right, Neil, but what is a generation to solve that crisis at US universities? I mean, these are the best universities in the world.
Not anymore.
Well,
they're not anymore. That's the harsh reality. Harvard comes bottom, dead last of the FIRE rankings for academic freedom. It is the worst university in America for free speech on campus. So they're not the best universities in the world anymore. They just aren't. Soon, the University of Austin will be better than the University of Harvard. And I look forward to that day in the next 10 years.
Neil, I spoke about the problem of history education at universities here in Australia, and I know you have spoken a lot about that too. One of the rebuttals to the research I was talking about was that, well, us academics, when we're coming up with subjects to teach, we're really responding to a market. And the students of 2024, they only want to study these certain types of subjects. So if we do these sort of boring, history of the British Empire or the Renaissance or, the Middle Ages, I mean, they're snooze fests. No one wants to study them, so why would we bother? We'll just do, race, gender and class in sort of 19th century Lebanon or something. I personally think that's a bit of an intellectually lazy argument.
But it's true.
But it's the argument put forward by quite serious people here in Australia that it's just a demand-based system and this is what the kids want.
Nothing, I can assure you, could be further from the truth. And we know this because we've run the experiment. The Stanford History Department has indeed run courses on transgender Chicano communities in Los Angeles in the 1920s. And not unsurprisingly, the registrations are in the low single digits. These experiments have been run. There are now more professors than majors in that department. I ran the experiment at Harvard of teaching a course called Western Ascendancy, Mainsprings of Global Power, which was the most popular course with Harvard undergraduates of all the history courses that were on offer. So this is not true. If you put on a course about the world wars, which hardly any universities offer these days, it's standing room only, because that's the kind of stuff the students want to study. The insane thing is that these departments persist in offering courses in identity politics that nobody shows up for. One day, I looked at the enrollments for the other courses that my colleagues were teaching. It's kind of classified information, but I got on well with the head of the department's bureaucracy. I'm like, Janet, can I have a look at that spreadsheet? Can I have a look? I realized what a mug I was, because I was teaching about a third to a half of all the undergraduates doing history. And all the other courses, with about 2 exceptions, had single-digit enrollments. The funny thing was that all these colleagues of mine who were teaching hardly any undergraduates and therefore doing hardly any work because you didn't have any papers to grade, they had the same number of votes as me when it came to graduate admissions. And so I realized after 5 years, oh my God, I'm doing all the teaching of the undergraduates and I have to staff my course with teaching fellows who are their graduate students. And their graduate students didn't even know what a bond yield was. I was teaching a financial history course. The Harvard undergraduates all knew what a bond yield was because they all had been interns at Goldman Sachs. But the TFs were PhDs who couldn't even spell yield. So this is what people don't understand about how universities work. It's institutions and incentives. Yeah. Your incentive, if you're a tenured professor, is not to have 100 students, because that is work. Your incentive is to teach the same course that you taught since you were a graduate student, based on your doctoral dissertation about Chicano transsexual communities and blah, 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 blah. That's what you do, because it's easy. And then you can spend a lot of time doing what? What do you do with your extra time? I tell you what you do. You go to committees. You turn up to all the committees. You live for the committees to make sure that nobody like Neil Ferguson ever gets hired again. That's just how it works. I mean, you can't blame it. It's smart. I was kind of dumb.
Yeah, I'm taking it you're not a member of many committees.
I think in most universities, there are probably more committees than individuals. They kind of actually outnumber the individuals. And most of these committees are startling for the amount of time they spend on doing nothing, achieving nothing. So part of what's fun about creating a new university is you just reinvent everything, do everything differently. We don't have tenure. We don't have departments. We have interdisciplinary centres and a constitution that specifies academic freedoms and responsibilities. And we have a judicial branch, which no other university has, an independent judiciary that will determine if somebody has violated the constitution. You don't need tenure. If your academic freedom is enshrined in a document, you can't be fired for anything you say. You can only be fired for being rubbish at your job, like in a real profession. Hands up the people in real professions. So, just turn being a professor into a real profession, and I think you can get rid of the activists pretty quickly.
And I'm guessing University of Austin doesn't have too many committees too.
We're trying to keep it to an absolute minimum, because I think what universities should be about is teaching. That's what it's about. Not indoctrination, because that's different. The professors should remember Max Weber's dictum that there are two separate vocations. Politics is over here, and there's some people in the room who do politics, and it's an honourable vocation. But it's a separate vocation from what Weber called Wissenschaft, scholarship. Anybody who goes into a lecture room engaged in politics is violating the implicit Hippocratic oath of the academy. You should not use your power as a professor to impose your ideology on the students. That's actually wrong. And it's something that we are going to be very tough about, because I think students should not be subject to those political pressures that I hear about regularly on the Stanford campus, where the students self-censor. Get this, 59% of undergraduates in the United States across the country say that they self-censor. They don't say what they think in class. There was a survey that just came out this week showing that Harvard professors are more afraid of their colleagues than of the students, so the professors also engage in self-censorship. That's why I say it's like a totalitarian culture. I last encountered this in East Germany in the 1980s. So it's very, very toxic. I'm pretty sure it's worse than it has yet become here. And that's why you have to guard against it and try to avoid going down this path, which is deeply detrimental to a society. Your elite inevitably goes through the best universities. Imagine the effect on the American elite, the Harvard, Yale, Stanford kids, of 4 years of self-censorship. What's that going to do to their moral fibre? Nothing good.
No. Neil, obviously you haven't been here in Australia observing the rising anti-Semitism that we have, but I suspect it's been very, very similar in the United States. I work at the University of Melbourne. I've observed the protests there, the abhorrent things that are said by protesters about Jewish people, about people who are their colleagues, their fellow students, their academics, and just people in the community, just on the basis of religion. This, to me, seemed to come out of nowhere. I didn't realise that there was such a large movement of people in Australia who had these sentiments. I thought that standing up, defending a terrorist organisation was an verboten. No one did that for Al-Qaeda, for ISIS, but apparently it's okay for Hezbollah and Hamas. I have had friends who are Jewish email me and message me and say that their grandparents, say Holocaust survivors, never thought this would, they thought this was over, never again, and it wouldn't happen, and that they can't believe that they are now just 2 generations hence experiencing what their grandparents experienced. Were you surprised by this, that there was this bubbling anti-Semitism deep in our communities that just is unleashed, or is it something you think history shows it just is cyclical and it does reappear?
I was not surprised, because I had been observing the strange, unholy fusion of the radical left and the Islamists happening as their networks encountered one another on university campuses. I'm a very lucky man,
because I'm married to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's one of the most courageous women in the world, who's, I have to say, she's actually much more interesting than me, so you should invite her next year. Better speaker too. She has educated me about how dawah works. You all have heard of jihad. But Ayaan explained to me that dawah is the non-violent proselytizing where the Muslim Brotherhood and like organizations build their networks, unobtrusively exploiting our tolerance, exploiting our laws, and establishing their mindset. Now, it took me a while to figure out Queers for Palestine. I was struggling a bit with that and trying to get my head around how people who were on one side of the woke progressive left could feel kinship with the Islamists, who, of course, were they to be in Gaza, would throw them off high buildings. But then I understood that the Brotherhood is very systematic in trying to win over the useful idiots. And the woke left are useful idiots to the Islamists. That is the process that we began to observe 10 years ago when Ayaan was disinvited by Brandeis University, a Jewish foundation, incidentally. Now, when that happened, because I'm from Glasgow, I went and I looked for the petition of all the people who called for my wife to be publicly humiliated by being disinvited from their graduation. Oh, I have the list. I know the names. The professor of queer studies on the same list as the Muslim Brotherhood representative from CARE, which is an Islamic front organization. And so you could see 10 years ago what was going on. Mm. So my colleagues are all terribly amazed, and Bill Ackman can't believe his eyes when 30 or however many student groups declare their support for Hamas the day after the most hideous massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. But I was not surprised because I had seen this being built for 10 years.
And can we turn it around? At the moment in Australia, the issue of migration and social cohesion, these are hot topics, and they come and go, I guess, as different political events take place. But the opposition and the government are both saying we have migration is too high and we need to bring it down. And we are fundamentally a migrant society. We welcome people from all over the world, and basically very happily, actually, and we are a model of social cohesion for our multi-ethnic society. But there are fissures that seem to be insurmountable at the moment because you have communities that are just in conflicts overseas, pitted against each other, and that is playing out in Australia. And you can't unmake people's familiar relationships with, back home with Lebanon, with Palestine, with Israel, and the like. So how do we fix this?
Well, there has been an overshoot. That's even more obvious in Canada. History is really clear on this. If the foreign-born population rises very large, very high, above 14 or 15% in a very short space of time, this can be very destabilizing to social cohesion. This is not anything other than an observation of historical reality. In the late 19th century, when the foreign-born share of the population rose above 14% in the United States, there was a populist backlash, and the Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. So it's not rocket science. Most of history, by the way, is quite easy. It's very easy to see that if you have a very big surge in immigration, there will be some kind of reaction against it. That's the first point. The second point is that if people come to Australia or the United Kingdom or the United States, they have to accept the rules, the laws, the constitutions, the culture that they find there. And Sharia law is not compatible with our laws and our culture. It's not. And so people who come here have to accept that they cannot have their own system of law adjacent to ours. And all the moves in the direction of multiculturalism, in Europe especially, to tolerate zones of Sharia were disastrous mistakes. Ghettos that have been created in countries like Sweden will take decades to solve the social problems because of the complete failure of assimilation that there has been. I'm an immigrant. It'd be hypocritical of me to be against immigration. My wife was an asylum seeker when she fled an arranged marriage and went to the Netherlands in the 1990s. We've both been beneficiaries of the possibility of crossing borders. But we've done so legally. And as we've moved, we've accepted the norms and laws of the societies that have accepted us. That's not complex. Robert Menzies was much criticised for his argument that the Communist Party should be prohibited in Australia. I was thinking a lot about that this afternoon. I'm not sure he was wrong. I'm not sure he was wrong about that. Because you see, the Communist Party was dedicated to the overthrow of capitalism. It was dedicated to the overthrow of democracy. It was loyal to the Soviet Union. When I first traveled to the United States, they would ask you, are you or have you any time been a member of the Communist Party? Good question to ask. How about, are you or have you at any time been a member of the Muslim Brotherhood? How about asking that? And how about if the answer is yes, bye. I mean, it's just clear, isn't it, that organizations that are dedicated to overthrowing our institutions should not be tolerated. That's not what tolerance is supposed to include. And I think that's been a mistake we've been making now for too long in the West. And it will be our undoing if we don't waken up to the threat that is posed by these deeply subversive networks. Make no mistake, they're quite explicit about what they're trying to achieve. I read a report this week from European intelligence agencies about the operations of the Muslim Brotherhood in Europe. The people running the intelligence agencies know what they are up against. It's the useful idiots on the political left who do nothing to stop it. Again, it's not too late. That's the really good news. It's not too late. But we do have to get real. And the only sole consolation, the only silver lining that comes out of October 7th last year is that it's been a wake-up call to a lot of people who weren't paying attention to what was going on.
Well, speaking of wake-up calls, several...
We go on like this.
I know. And this is the last one. This is the last one because...
California, everybody would have gone by now.
Yeah, well, you know. We've got staying power in Melbourne.
It's kind of weird to still be talking at 10 past 10.
Neil, you wrote, I don't know, 10 years ago or so about Cold War II. Robert Menzies, Cold War Prime Minister for Australia, of course, from 49 to 66, tried to ban the Communist Party, got Australia involved in the Korean War, Vietnam War, Konfrontasi, Malayan Emergency, all these sort of, Cold War military conflicts. Australia was,
he was right about all of that.
Yeah, but Australia, like the United States, we'd come out of World War II. We had the sense of our convictions. We believed in democracy. We believed in freedom, and we knew we were right. 2024, we see the West, or the US, failing to deter Russia invades Ukraine. It's failed to deter Iran and, its proxies. We've seen October 7th. Will we be able to deter China when it comes to Taiwan? Because, look, let's be honest, the record ain't great.
It's not great.
No.
This is my big worry. This is my big concern, that within the term of the next president of the United States, there is quite likely to be a Taiwan crisis. And this is far more directly relevant to Australians than where the border between Russia and Ukraine is drawn. Because if Taiwan goes, the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific fundamentally alters, and the Japanese and the South Koreans will adapt immediately. There are a bunch of scenarios that we need to think about here, and they're complex and difficult. We know from Bill Burns that Xi has told his military to be ready for war by 2027. We know that the Chinese are engaged in stockpiling and in many ways sanctions-proofing their economy. I was in Beijing in May. There clearly is a faction in the government that is focused on preparation for war. Not all of them. There's another faction which is very worried about the economy, but I do not think that they have the upper hand. Xi has made it his goal to bring Taiwan under the control of the CCP. He's already done it to Hong Kong. His reason for extending his term in office was Taiwan. I've been told by Chinese colleagues that he's more risk-averse than Putin and he won't gamble on conflict. But I'm not sure that I believe that. And the reason I don't believe it is that we're so bad at deterring at this point that I don't see that we're deterring him. They conduct exercises, they just did it a couple of weeks ago, with impunity in and around Taiwan. They're practicing the blockade. So the mistake that many people made in Europe and in America in 2021 was not to realize that when Putin said there was a historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people, he was declaring his intention to annex Ukraine. And I drove myself crazy trying to explain to people, he is going to do this. On the very first week of January 2022, I opened my column in Bloomberg with the line, "War is coming." It's amazing how few people would believe me. And the same problem plays out again, where people see the Chinese rehearsing a blockade. They see the intelligence saying they're preparing for war in 2027, and yet we act like somehow it can't happen. This is the definition of insanity. So I think we have to assume that this is a high probability scenario until there is some real deterrence in place. And there isn't now. Because in all the war games, China wins. And often at very high cost. When I said there are multiple scenarios, this is a scenario in which it's World War III. I know we've got late, but this is highly relevant to you. Okay? So Admiral Sam Paparo is commanding officer of Indo-Pacific Command. He was asked this summer what he would do if China blockaded Taiwan. He replied, I'm wondering what's in that.
Yeah, I know. It's dangerous.
Yes. It's been through a metal detector, hasn't it?
No.
Paparo says, my job is to turn the Taiwan Strait into a hellscape. That's, in fact, I think, the name of the operation, the official name, hellscape. And hellscape is massive deployment of unmanned sea drones against Chinese vessels. And my question is, what happens after that? Did the Chinese say, sorry, just a mistake, we'll go home? I don't think so. So it's like the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Khrushchev sends the naval expedition to run the blockade that Kennedy imposed around Cuba. That was nearly World War III. We were that close. Because the order, as you all know, the order was given by the submarine commander to fire the nuclear-tipped torpedo at the surface, U.S. naval surface vessels. And just by sheer good luck, a superior officer was on board and countermanded the order. If that hadn't happened, World War III would have happened. So in this scenario, there's clearly a really frightening contingency in which it escalates in the way that Jim Stavridis wrote about in his book of a couple of years ago. But there's another scenario in which the U.S. falls. Let me take you to the Situation Room before we all go home. The Chinese blockade's been imposed. Madam President, says the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, We are ready with Hellscape, Madam President, and the Japanese Air Force is ready to bomb the Chinese missile bases. And you give the order. And President Harris doesn't cackle at this point. Not laughing. Turns to the Treasury Secretary and says, Janet, where will the market be at the open if we do this? And she says, we polled a bunch of people on this last week, a bunch of investors, 30% off, we estimate. You say the stock market will be down 30%. Yes, Madam President. So in that scenario, does Hellscape happen? I don't think so. Because she's Khrushchev at that point. And Khrushchev, as we all know, took the secret deal and backed down. So there's another scenario in which Taiwan is peacefully handed over to China to avoid World War III and stop the stock market selling off at 30%. This is all very near term. This can happen in the next 4 years. And that's why deterrence matters, to try and close the circle. What goes on in our universities, what goes on amongst our young people, what they get from TikTok, what they get from the blue-haired professors, all of this poses a threat from within. But why that matters is that if we're weak within, the threat from outside, from the Axis powers, from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, that threat becomes a very, very dangerous one indeed. There's no guarantee that we win Cold War II. The sample size of Cold Wars, where's my political scientist friend, is Air 2. We can't generalize, we can't be confident that this Cold War will also last 40 years and the good guys win. It might not be like that. The roles are reversed. If we're the ones running the blockade, we are the Soviets. And that's the thing that really troubles me, the sense that in this Cold War, we might actually lose. That's the reason why institutions like the Robert Menzies Institute really matter. They really matter. Do give to this institution. It's fundamental. I'm not kidding. Philanthropy is no laughing matter. Australians and British people just don't give enough money to organizations like this. Americans get this right. They know that a free society requires free institutions that speak freely. That's why I'm here. That's why this matters. So my final message to you before the chimes of midnight is support this institute, because Robert Menzies was a hell of a man. He was one of the real founders of modern Australia. And we need to make sure that the next generation of Australians are not on TikTok imbibing CCP propaganda, but are reading about this guy and understanding what they are the heirs of and the duties and responsibilities that being the heir of Menzies carries with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.